Have you ever finished watching a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel, and then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after one? Well then this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel.
The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And today, for our second edition, we're going to be exploring the history of one of the most iconic sports movies and the most epic cinematic falls from grace of all time. Caddyshack managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat in the early 1980s, going from a raging party of a production under an inexperienced director to somehow becoming a smash hit and even a cultural landmark, helping to establish movie stars and major Hollywood players in the process. 8 years later, however, when it came to its successor, Caddyshack II flopped hard with audiences and critics. Derided as one of the worst sequels of all time, it remains a shining example of how not to follow up a hit movie. But how exactly did Caddyshack go from partying at the clubhouse to being lost in the sandbank? Did anything go right when it came to Part 2's truly tumultuous journey to the screen? And how does the evolution of a dancing gopher encapsulate the rapid decline of the series?
When I was your age, I would lug 50 pounds of ice up 5-6 flights of stairs.
So what?
So what? So let's dance!
Caddyshack returns to the tour and immediately drops off the leaderboard. For good. This is Sequelpalooza. Before we get back to the shack, if you like this kind of thing and want to support the channel, then please do consider subscribing to Culture Slice to stay up to date with Sequelpalooza and all of the other videos coming over the next year and beyond. The first episode of Sequelpalooza, which covers the ups and downs of the never-ending story on the big screen, is available now, as is our 2-hour deep dive into the full history of the ultimate example of Hollywood's obsession with the sequel, Police Academy. But for now, let's get back to the heady days of the late 1970s and early 1980s to explore the unexpected birth of a future comedy film classic.
What you are about to see has a mechanical gopher in it. The money could have been spent on more of me. Thank you.
At the dawn of the 1980s, the remnants of 70s culture remained somewhat omnipresent. MTV, which would have such an enormous impact on the sound, star names and aesthetic of popular culture, wouldn't launch until the second half of 1981, and despite a considerable late 70s backlash and the fact that its days were numbered, disco still had some presence in the charts. In fact, the biggest hit of the summer of 1980 was Funky Town. The 80s would eventually see drastic change take place in culture and the wider world. For now though, the number one song in America at the start of the year was the same as the last number one of the 1970s, the Pina Colada song. But there was one trend which began in the 70s that would carry on through the 80s and beyond. Film comedy was in the midst of a not-so-quiet revolution. Released 2 years earlier in the summer of 1978, National Lampoon's Animal House had become a surprise blockbuster, taking home over $120 million in its initial cinema run against a budget of just $3 million. The fact that it remained until Ghostbusters in 1984 the most profitable comedy of all time completely reshaped Hollywood's perspective on the genre going forward.
Sorry.
Establishing the trend for slobs versus snobs comedies, Animal House remains one of the most influential films of this or any era. It was also a major Hollywood breakthrough for two of its writers, Harold Ramis and Doug Kenney. Ramis and Kenney had both built up strong resumes in the comedy world before Animal House, notably with the likes of Second City and National Lampoon respectively, but they were now able to penetrate the mainstream. Kenney's work on National Lampoon would become enormously influential in ushering in a new era for comedy before they both left their day jobs to write Animal House with another Lampoon writer, Chris Miller. It was the first screenplay any of them had produced. Nobody at Universal Pictures expected the film to be such an enormous hit, but it was, going on to be a cultural event. More important than that, to many in Hollywood though, it cost very little and made a lot of money. Despite the success of Animal House though, Ramis didn't have a straightforward job getting his next picture, which he wanted to direct, off the ground. Ramis and Kenney organised a pitch meeting with executive producer John Peters, who had signed an exclusive development deal with Orion Pictures, a newer studio with a distribution agreement with Warner's. Fresh off the Animal House bonanza, Ramis and Kenney pitched ideas such as a satirical look at the American Nazi Party and something about a revisionist Marxist Western, but they didn't get very far. Another idea, however, did pique Peters' interest, and it was one which came from Ramis's co-writers Kenney and Brian Doyle Murray. This idea could essentially be boiled down to a single line: Animal House on a golf course. Their experiences of working as golf caddies in their youth shaped the narrative and characters which populated the script they would deliver, Caddyshack. The core story of Caddyshack initially revolved around a down-on-his-luck caddy who is vying for a scholarship as he wants to go to college and the life of the caddies at Bushwood Country Club. But in reality, the film's plot was rendered as flimsy as a boat when an anchor falls through it, as it became clear that the level of comedy talent they had managed to cast could not be contained, and the members, staff and residents of the club, who were supposed to be supporting characters, ended up being focal points of the film. Though the main caddy Danny, played by Michael O'Keefe, remained an important part of the story, other caddies' roles ended up being drastically cut. As Ramis himself put it once, they had planned to make a coming-of-age film and instead ended up with a Marx Brothers movie. The comedians who did take up far more screen time than originally planned also became the iconic players who have made Caddyshack the surprise and long-lasting success that it became. Bill Murray was one of a number of new comedy TV stars established on Saturday Night Live, the revolutionary late-night weekly show. He managed to lead a hit movie in 1979, Meatballs, co-written by Ramis, although he had already been cast in Caddyshack by that point. He also happened to be Brian Doyle Murray's brother. He took the role of Carl, the groundskeeper charged with catching the film's other protagonist, Mr. Gopher. More on him later. Chevy Chase had been one of the original stars of Saturday Night Live and had transitioned to film work after leaving the show, legitimizing his big screen career with the movie Foul Play in 1978, which was a hit and earned Chase a Golden Globe nomination. It's fair to say that he was a household name by this point, but it wasn't like Chevy Chase was the bankable comedy movie star he would become as the 1980s progressed. Chase had turned down a role in Animal House and he wasn't going to make the same mistake again. He played Zen Playboy Country Club heir Ty Webb. Rodney Dangerfield was a stand-up comedy name and a regular on The Tonight Show, but he hadn't established himself as a movie star at this point. When he auditioned for the role of Al, the real estate developer who doesn't quite fit into the stuffy country club, the story goes that he walked into the room, dropped his trousers and exclaimed, "Let's eat." He got the part. The lead roles were completed by sitcom star Ted Knight as the country club founder and the snob unhappy with the influx of slobs to the course, whose feud with Dangerfield's Al ends up becoming the focal point of much of the movie. Doug Kenney, at 32 years of age, would combine his writing duties with the role of producer. He had, of course, never produced a movie before. Though Ramis didn't know how to make a movie, and Kenney had never produced one, they knew they wanted to shoot away from California to ensure more freedom from the execs. For the country club setting of the film, they secured the Rolling Hills Country Club in Davie, Florida, explaining to the studio that they wanted to avoid the Illinois-based film being set at a golf club with the palm trees of Southern California. They ended up shooting at a country club with, yes, palm trees. Production took place over an 11-week period between September and November 1979. The shoot was wild, quite literally. Hurricane David swept through Florida for large parts of it, delaying work considerably. Although, on the plus side, that did allow the cast and crew to party like mad in their hotel. Even when the weather was better, most still spent their nights partying. The drug intake around the shoot has become the stuff of legend, on a set which Chase once described as pretty nuts. Ramis reflected on this decades later. "We shot the movie in 1979. It was a pretty debauched country at the time. The cocaine business in southern Florida was mammoth, and everyone was doing everything." Fueled and ready to rock, the key creative players had been used to doing improv. They leaned into what they knew best. Subplots like Dangerfield's Al and Knight's snobby judge agreeing to a high-stakes pairs golf match, and largely improvised scenes such as the last-minute Bill Murray and Chevy Chase nighttime golfing edition ended up taking more and more prominence. As Chris Nashawati, whose excellent book, Caddyshack, The Making of a Hollywood Cinderella Story, is well worth picking up a copy of, points out, there was a script when they got to Florida to film, but they pretty much put it in the trash and let the really experienced improv comedians just go freestyle. 9 times out of 10 that was going to be a complete disaster, but they managed to pull this one off. But they did it by the skin of their teeth. The original edit is rumoured to have been 4.5 hours long. The gopher was a late addition, and let's talk about that gopher for a second. Created by John Dykstra, the legendary effects lead of Star Wars fame, the gopher was a mixture of puppet and animatronic hydraulics, and his team created the maze of tunnels seen in the movie. Much of this was done after the main shoot had wrapped, and allowed Ramis and team to knit together the disparate freewheeling comedy moments they'd managed to shoot into something more cohesive. In the years and decades that followed, he has become a valuable and profitable mascot. In many ways, the gopher made Caddyshack work. As producer John Peters stated, even if not many agreed with his summation at the time, "When I saw the gopher in, I felt like it was going to be a huge hit." Although this wouldn't be the case forever, for now, Mr. Gopher was on top of the world. Although, spoiler alert, things would get worse for him and us later in the decade. Anyway. As well as the film's score from Johnny Mandel, the soundtrack for Caddyshack featured not only the iconic Any Way You Want It by Journey, musical inspiration for the Dangerfield shuffle scene on the course, but also a selection of songs from Kenny Loggins, an already successful singer-songwriter and future king of the movie soundtrack, who provided the single I'm Alright as the film's theme tune. Reaching number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100, Caddyshack would prove a pivotal moment for Loggins' own career in movies, just as it did for many of its stars. It's fair to say that Caddyshack's soundtrack featured top 40 bangers, and even became something of a template for many films' use of popular music as the 80s progressed. Caddyshack opened on July 25, 1980, at a time when the likes of the Blues Brothers, Airplane and yes, Cheech and Chong's next movie were already in cinemas. The box office behemoth towering over everything else released that summer, however, was The Empire Strikes Back, which went on to make over $209 million in North America, more than double anything else managed across the year. Although Caddyshack was unlikely to ever compete with the sequel to George Lucas's all-conquering Star Wars, things initially looked bleak for it to compete with other comedies of the time. Initial reviews weren't exactly glowing. Dismissed as the latest misbegotten spawn of Animal House, and hanging evidence that Ramis wasn't prepared for the assignment or clever enough to fake it, even though both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert liked it well enough, they were very much in the minority. The Boston Globe's review seemed to tie together the general consensus. Caddyshack represents everything that is wrong with contemporary film comedy. Box Office 2 wasn't mind-blowing, at least initially. Debuting in second place behind Empire Strikes Back, it never ended up making anything close to Animal House in cinemas. In the end though, it was a decent-sized hit. It drew almost $40 million in North America, dwarfing its budget, and would finish worldwide with over $60 million. It was also clear that the film had connected with an audience, and that it had the potential to maintain a huge second life in home media. Lord only knows how much residual cash it has made from its endless TV reruns, video, DVD and Blu-ray sales over the decades, but the movie has ended up well and truly becoming an indelible part of pop culture. I guess from me waxing lyrical about a puppet gopher, you can tell that I'm a fan of this movie. And it's true, I think Caddyshack is great. I mean, it's not objectively a great movie in some more technical aspects, some of the laughs are pretty juvenile, and even with the gopher, it's a bit disjointed at times. But in the ways that truly matter, it's really, really great. If you catch my drift. The construct of the movie is basic, of course, but it's the perfect platform for some of the best comic actors of the era to deliver a lot of their absolute finest work. Caddyshack is rough around the edges, and you can sense the chaotic set in almost every scene, but it's a glorious mess, and it's just a shame there aren't movies like this made much in the modern era. I mean, aside from the all-time classic quotable lines, it's worth watching for the dancing alone. Who knows if this style of movie would mesh with the expectations of younger audiences, but the ethos behind Caddyshack should be upheld and cherished. If ever a movie didn't need a sequel, it was this one, but this wouldn't be Sequelpalooza if things had been left alone after the first. If they really had to make a sequel, a rapid-fire return to the shack maybe could have worked alright. But what we ended up getting was far, far worse.
Hey, everybody! We're all gonna get laid!
In the years between Caddyshack appearing at cinemas and its sequel's production chugging into gear, the world at large had seen drastic changes. And so had the key players who had made that strange 1980 golf comedy such a massive success. Harold Ramis had not only co-written and co-starred in Ghostbusters, which loomed over pop culture after its release in 1984, but he had also reunited with Chevy Chase to direct National Lampoon's Vacation, another franchise starter, a year earlier. It hadn't all gone swimmingly though. His 1986 Robin Williams comedy Club Paradise had flatlined almost totally, but by this point, the Caddyshack director was a big Hollywood name. Speaking of Chevy, he had become one of the most recognizable faces of 80s cinema, starring in not just Vacation and its European sequel, but also Fletch, Spies Like Us, and The Three Amigos. He was so much a part of the establishment now that he'd even hosted the Oscars. Rodney Dangerfield had gone from a Hollywood rookie to a one-man comedy franchise, continuing stand-up success, but also starring in the likes of Easy Money and Back to School, the latter of which made more than $90 million in 1986. Bill Murray's career had headed to the stratosphere after he joined Ramis in Ghostbusters, a trajectory which would only continue in the late 80s and early 90s. His brother Brian continued to make regular appearances in major films, many of which co-starred his fellow Caddyshack alumni, while Michael O'Keefe starred in box office bombs like Savage Islands, Finders Keepers, and The Slugger's Wife. Doug Kenny, who at age 33 had achieved and influenced so much in modern American comedy, would sadly pass away on vacation in Hawaii just weeks after the release of Caddyshack, at a time when he was looking to escape what appeared at first to be the negative reaction to the film he had helped create. He would never be able to revel in its later success, and perhaps his untimely passing is another reason why a more immediate sequel wasn't developed. Ted Knight, such a big part of the success of that first film, would also pass in 1986 due to cancer. Caddyshack would prove to be his final film role. In the 1980s, the first real age of Hollywood's obsession with the sequel, it is perhaps a surprise that it took so long for the idea to bring back the Shack to gain some momentum, but so many of those involved had used it as a platform for future success that they didn't really need to return to Caddyshack, and the first movie had tied the story's loose ends up so nicely anyway. Warner Brothers, the studio behind it, were keen though. By the mid-80s, tentpole summer movies were a driving force for the industry, and Warners were missing a comedy, hit for their summer 1988 release slate. Rodney Dangerfield, who had made $35 grand for part 1, agreed to return when he realised he could make $7 million for making Caddyshack II, and original executive producer John Peters was also on board. The plan was for Alan Meter, Dangerfield's director for Back to School, to take over helming duties. To ensure that Ramis, who had co-written Back to School for Dangerfield, was involved in the script, the studio used the old Krusty the Clown Canyonero approach. The studio begged me. They said, "Hey, we've got a great idea. The Shack is back." And I said, "No, I don't think so." But they said that Rodney really wanted to do it. The classic argument came up, which says that if you don't do it, someone will, and it will be really bad. Against his own better judgment, in the summer of 1987, he agreed to write the script along with his old Second City colleague PJ Tarokve. All the other stars were either unable or unwilling to be involved, and with so many years having passed, it was going to be very difficult to recapture whatever magic there was left. Things started unravelling from pretty much the very beginning of the process. Dangerfield rapidly became disillusioned with the script. Chevy Chase, who had very clearly shown no interest in coming back, eventually did agree to return in what amounted to little more than a cameo for a favour and a 7-figure check. But his heart wasn't in it either. After the studio had spent more than $2 million on pre-production and even built him his own personal sauna on set, with less than a month to go before filming was due to begin, Dangerfield could see the writing was on the wall and left the project, a move which instigated major legal battles between him and Warner's. His director Meter was relieved of his duties, and Ramis took Dangerfield's departure as his cue to exit stage left as well. Even though his name remained on the movie, the final script ended up having very little to do with his original screenplay. Without a director or a star, the script was a mess, and essentially nobody from the original was still on board. Aside from an almost entirely disinterested Chevy Chase, and of course Mr. Gopher, Warner's had a movie project to save, and they were still hell-bent on a summer 1988 release. Alan Arkush agreed to take on the director's chair without any knowledge of the legal trouble between Warner's and Dangerfield. Years later, he admitted that Caddyshack II eventually sent him to therapy. "I should have never made this movie. What was I thinking?" Arkush had directed the 1978 Ramones starring Rock and Roll High School, along with many episodes of TV shows such as The Twilight Zone, LA Law, and Moonlighting. He was keen to make another movie, and this was set to be a fairly major one, I guess. To replace Dangerfield in the lead role, the studio wanted Jackie Mason. Arkush raised concerns, but was told that without Mason, the green light on production would be gone. The screenplay, given an uncredited overhaul by Who Framed Roger Rabbit writers Jeffrey Price and Stephen Seaman, revolved around Jack, played by Mason, a rich property developer in the vein of Dangerfield's character from Part 1. He is encouraged by his daughter, played by Jessica Lundy, to join the Bushwood Club so she can climb the social ladder. His application is rejected, and he also makes an enemy in the form of Robert Stack's snobby country club president. Jack buys a majority share in the country club from Chevy Chase's Ty Webb, turns it into a pretty horrifying golf amusement park called Jackie's Wacky Golf, and eventually it is agreed that a golf match will take place for control of the club. There's also a subplot involving Dan Aykroyd being hired as an assassin, but ending up in a war with the returning Mr. Gopher, and Randy Quaid steals a few scenes as Mason's firebrand lawyer. Though golf and caddying aren't really prioritised, future Weekend at Bernie's star Jonathan Silverman does play the lead caddy here. The shoot was less chaotic than the first film, but also far less enjoyable. The director struggled with Mason constantly forgetting his lines, the costume department struggled with Mason eating so much at catering that his clothes had to be regularly let out, and the golf trainers struggled with Mason clearly showing absolutely no aptitude for the sport. Chevy Chase showed the whole thing complete disdain from the beginning, and Dan Aykroyd, who had agreed to replace Murray as the gopher chaser of Part 2, put on a weird, off-putting voice that the filmmakers hated, but at this stage presumably most had written this off as a disaster already. When it was ready to be screened, it was painfully obvious how true that was. Ramis recalls going to one of the first research screenings and crawling out of the theatre because we didn't want anyone to see us. Even Mason seemed to know where things were headed, if you read between the lines, when he appeared on David Letterman in the days before it hit cinemas.
Tell me about the movie, Caddyshack II. This opens Friday, huh? But did the movie turn out all right?
I think the movie is going to be one of the great sensations of all time. I say it for only one reason. It didn't come out yet. Nobody could call me a liar.
Hi, Culture Slice here, and welcome to this week's edition of Film 1988. After a summer dominated by the technical marvel that is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Eddie Murphy in Coming to America, and Crocodile Dundee 2, it's time to head back to the shack for Caddyshack II. After the absolute carnage behind the scenes in bringing the sequel to the screen, with barely any of the original cast or crew on board for Part 2, could this somehow end up becoming the comedy hit of the summer? Sorry, got stuck in time there, back to my old late 80s TV presenting gig for a second. Anyway, Caddyshack 2 was released on July 22nd, 1988, and when it did come out, the reality of the sequel's awfulness was exposed for the world to see. It received almost universally scathing reviews, lambasted by critics as shoddy, lazy, and numbingly stupid, a disaster, and a pathetic sequel to a great comedy. The New York Times review summed it up. Caddyshack 2 is the kind of film that sends careers spiraling downward. So, yeah, Caddyshack 2, everybody! Woo, yeah! Where do you start with this one? Jackie Mason had been a notable comedian with a rocky career path for decades. He saw a career resurgence in the 80s though, after appearing in both The Jerk and Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1. Even if he was a recognisable name, however, anyone with even a passing knowledge of him would understand that the studio's choice of casting him in Caddyshack 2, even at this time, was thoroughly perplexing. His romance with Diane Cannon might be one of the least convincing ever committed to film. Mason playing the Dangerfield part, fighting against the snobs of the country club is one of the most miscast roles in cinema history, no doubt about it. But the entire cast, talented though some of them might be, looked very dodgy from the start. Replacement actors playing thinly veiled caricatures of characters from the first movie. I imagine Dan Aykroyd almost immediately regretted his last-minute decision to take a role here. This is not his finest work. Robert Stack and Randy Quaid are just working with such poor stuff, although they didn't phone it in, unlike some. The humour in Caddyshack II is so base level it's embarrassing and almost always unfunny. When the first film had comedians in their pomp, riffing freestyle improvisations, creating whole scenes on the fly with numerous iconic lines, this feels almost entirely contrived. The decision to make this one to achieve a PG certificate neuters a lot of the potential, I guess, but the story and characters are so poorly written in the end, it wouldn't have made a difference whatever rating the film was striving for. Even the Gopher, an iconic addition to Part 1, is a much less welcome guest here. The character evolution of Mr. Gopher in Part 2 is totally bemusing, and the speaking voice it's given is a bit disturbing. And genuinely, who is this movie made for? Were they aiming for the family market? One legitimate positive of Caddyshack 2 was that they managed to get Kenny Loggins to record a new theme tune. Like many of the stars of that original film, Loggins' film career had taken off after Caddyshack. He'd provided memorable songs for the likes of Footloose, Over the Top, and of course, Top Gun. For Caddyshack 2, he delivered the 80s-tastic and still awesome to this day, Nobody's Fool, a song which ended up being far more fondly remembered than the movie it came from. A movie this bad does not deserve a theme song this good. Nobody's Fool would eventually make it to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, making Loggins the first male solo artist to achieve 4 top 10 singles from 4 different soundtrack albums. An 80s stat if there ever was one. So that's one positive for Caddyshack 2, I guess. But the thing is, Nobody's Fool would have been a hit with or without the movie, so this really has to go down as a partial credit at best. It does make the opening titles one of the best parts of the film though. Anyway, Caddyshack 2 was released on July 22nd, 1988 and became a massive bomb at the box office, managing to make it to number 8 in its first week on release, behind Big Top Pee-wee. After one more week, it would drop out of the US box office top 10 for good. The Shack was back for 2 weeks. In the end, it made just $11 million in cinemas after costing more than $25 million to make. Everything was so last minute with Caddyshack 2, and almost everyone involved soon realised it was a horrible mistake. Ramis bailed when there was talk of Mason replacing Dangerfield, and the entire project really should have followed suit. Caddyshack 2 remains a monument of precisely how a sequel should not be done.
Hey, Jack, how's it going?
Terrible. I'm hungry and I have to go to the bathroom.
It seems to me that there are 2 main ways to deliver a successful sequel. 1. To keep the party going, maintain and expand on what made the original movie work so well with already established characters. Or 2. To have a concept which goes well beyond the confines of that first film, maybe with an increased budget or scale, totally flipping and exceeding the audience's expectations in a good way. Caddyshack II failed to get close to either of these benchmarks. The first film's production had been a freewheeling party of a shoot, a product of its time, with all the positives and negatives that came with that for cast and crew. Its sequel was a corporate, sanitized wannabe, a representation of the worst tendencies of 80s Hollywood without retaining any of its charm. Caddyshack II is not so bad that it ends up actually being perversely good, it's just painful to watch. Aside from the actual quality of the film, timing is of course the other issue. Caddyshack was released when the Slobs vs Snobs R-rated comedy was fresh, but by the time 8 years had passed, Caddyshack 2 felt like the most uncool film ever made. It took 8 years and felt like it was hacked together in an afternoon. In some ways, the dulling down of Caddyshack represents a wider change in Hollywood and society as a whole. The wild days of the late 70s had been followed by reality checks. 2 years after Caddyshack producer Kenny's passing, John Belushi, the hard partying star who had helped make Animal House such a hit, died at the same age of just 33. It wouldn't have been possible to make a movie the way they had in 1979 when it came to the sequel, but it still didn't need to be this bad. As originally envisaged though, Caddyshack 2 could have been somewhat less of a mess. With Dangerfield returning and Ramis on scripting duties, the plan had been for Sam Kinison, a wild stand-up comedian and a close friend of Dangerfield who had also been in Back to School, to join the cast. Who knows if that could have worked, but I don't see how it could have possibly been nearly as awful as what we did get. Such is life, I guess. Maybe if Caddyshack had been more about the caddies as first intended, it would have ended up just another forgotten Slobs vs Snobs movie arriving in the wake of Animal House. But in the end, largely thanks to its casting, we got something much more special. The first film's enduring appeal can be partly laid at its broad audience. Teens and young adults enjoyed it, but so did the older country club crowd. Rodney Dangerfield was making Reagan cry with laughter later in the 80s. The boomer audience would gravitate to the likes of him and Chevy Chase. They became the acceptable faces of raucous comedy. Their careers would peak in the years which followed Caddyshack, becoming synonymous with the 1980s as two of its most recognisable film headliners. By the 1990s though, their stars had fallen somewhat. Chevy was briefly hosting his own truly disastrous late-night talk show, and Rodney was voicing a talking dog called Rover Dangerfield, although both he and Mason did become two of the most memorable guest stars of the golden age of The Simpsons.
As long as everybody's here, let's party!
After its release, Caddyshack became an example of how, in life, success and failure are not defined instantly. Nobody was assuming it would be lauded when it opened in 1980 to lukewarm reviews and box office, but over time it has become just that. Feels like one of those movies which has always been there, and given its production history, it's something of a miracle that it ended up the way it did. The film remains a cultural touchpoint more than 40 years after its release, constantly referenced in popular culture and regularly mentioned as one of the greatest comedies of all time. Is it the funniest sports movie ever? Possibly. Is Caddyshack 2 the worst sequel of all time? Honestly, there's an argument that it could be, certainly of the 80s, but that might ring true for numerous other films we will be covering in this series. Rubbish, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, and there's maybe a couple of small moments which could save it from the eternal abyss of abysmal cinematic failures. Maybe. In the end though, time washes away Hollywood's sins. While Part 2 languishes on Rotten Tomatoes with terrible critic and audience scores, although 4% does seem quite high, its predecessor still stands proudly. Reviews have become kinder to Caddyshack over time. The paying public made it a sensation not too long after it arrived. Whatever the absolute state of that sequel ended up being, we're still left with an original which somehow became one of the very best comedies of an iconic era for movies, despite, or most likely because of, the fact that you can almost smell the stench of 70s party coming off the screen. Because, in the immortal words of one of the best soundtrack songs of the 1980s, any way you want it, that's the way you need it, any way you want it. Or, as Ty Webb would put it, be the ball. Just be the ball.